picture I'm giving. When you conduct the statistical analysis, it's more complex. Students runs away, no, we don't want to do this. So that is what we have to do. So education for the energy and environment, E means energy and environment sector. This, you have also read this thing. Education, we still don't have 200 people. 200 university, we have so many 650 university and 3,000 colleges. We don't have any one of them ranking among the first 200 in the world. Then what we are doing? Despite our national education policy say that anyone should be subject, and Supreme Court decision is there that anyone should be subject at all levels. Still we are not able to. So we have to increase our ranking in the midst when you have to increase your quality of your education. Then some remedial measures. Time is not there. 1 minute is remaining, so you can read this. Improve level of energy and environmental education at all levels. From my point of view, at school level, I think now at school level is there, because my sons are reading. They are in first and second standard. Energy and environmental education should be, basic knowledge should be completed at school level, not at undergraduate or graduate level. That you should develop the expertise there. Special focus on higher education for developing expertise. For basic things and unskilled jobs, you can get it done even lack of knowledge, less education. And encourage practical application in the field. So this is the last slide. I'll come back to the first slide, how the jobs are there. The first, you see the first, these 4 photographs. The first one is, and background is the agriculture, Jatropha agriculture. Anybody can do, maybe 5th standard, 8th standard, 10th standard, doesn't matter. Jatropha cultivation can be done by anybody. Then first photograph says, this shows that Jatropha fruit, and then it can be plugged when it is dry by anyone. Then seeds are there, they can be put into expeller by anyone. But then when you come to this Jatropha biodiesel production stage, then you need expertise here. And then you see the research goes, and you have to test the quality, physical property, chemical property of the diesel, biodiesel which you are producing. So you can see this also shows some way of how the jobs are being created, skilled, unskilled, and expert level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Clearly, deep knowledge and experience in the sector. We'd love to hear you more during the question answer session as well. But without wasting time, let me invite Saptarishi Das, who's Research Associate at TERI, to make his presentation. Saptarishi, can I request you to be even shorter, about 10 minutes?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, good evening. So I think we had a fairly comprehensive discussion so far. So what I'll try to do is, so keep it short. I'm going to kind of complement the previous 2 discussions. So we've seen that green development of green technologies and green jobs can go hand in hand. So what I'm going to talk about is the potential for India to go towards a green trajectory, so how we can change the energy system. Personally, I'm not really into a labor market or into jobs, but rather I work on environment system modeling. So the topic is sort of tangential, but I'll still try to keep it as relevant as possible. So I'll try to contextualize India's green growth story with the green job requirement. So clearly there is a need for rapid and inclusive growth, because we are all aware of the development needs that our country is in need of, from poverty, energy poverty, lack of job opportunities, etc. And the implications of pursuing different growth trajectories can have very different can have very different implications on technology uptake and the policy choices that need to be made. And we also, when we are deciding on going on for an energy trajectory or a development trajectory, we need to take a sort of a holistic evaluation of the costs and co-benefits of the options that we choose. The role of renewables, so clearly we have so far established that development or jobs created in the renewable sectors can be, are classified as green jobs. So what are the roles that renewable technologies can play? Provide greater access to clean technology, of course, contributing positively to local as well as global environment. Definitely, it brings down the CO2 pollution and therefore it's carbon neutral. Enhancing energy security, that's another concern for a country like India, where we have got growing import dependence on coal and oil. We have almost no oil reserves, and our coal reserves are also, coal production has also stagnated over the years. So there is a growing concern of energy security, and provide opportunities for improving employment prospects. Now, clearly, when we're talking about green jobs, create employment prospects, and as we saw in the last presentation, green jobs can be more labor intensive, so there is a possibility of higher employment there. Also, it's more distributed. Renewable technologies can be decentralized, so as a result, it could create jobs in a more decentralized manner in rural areas or in hard-to-reach areas, etc., especially relevant for a country like India. The growing recognition of potential for green job creation with green technology. So these are some of the studies of different organizations have taken. So it's essentially a literature review, really. So you can read it. So it accounts for approximately 2.3 million jobs worldwide. This is a UNEP estimates. EU has highlighted the potential for RE technology. So these are all reports that are available out there. Some of the US studies, for every US dollar in 2005, 1 billion spent on green fiscal measures had the potential to create about 33,000 jobs. So these are some of the studies that are there. I'll quickly skip through this because I think you could see it if the presentation is shared with you. India's future challenges. So there's a concern of energy access. So clearly, as I mentioned, there's approximately 300 million people in India who still do not have access to electricity. And around 80% of a rural population is dependent on traditional biomass. So access to clean energy is an important concern for India. Energy import vulnerabilities, of course, and climate change. And what are the options and what are the implications for adopting alternate energy? So we've done a scenario-based sort of illustration that I'll just explain. This is a study that we conducted for WWF, and it was to see the potential for India to reach a very high renewable scenario, so incorporate renewable technologies in its energy mix to the outer bounds of technical feasibility, not outer bounds, actually to the bounds of technical feasibility. So the scenarios, they're essentially bottom-up integrated modeling framework using the Markle model, which is, and so it compares two scenarios, which is a business as usual. We call it the reference scenario, which considers current trends and policies. And we also developed an alternate scenario where we are sort of trying to go green, where we incorporate all kinds of renewable technologies currently present, as well as one that have the potential to develop in the next 1 or 2 decades. And what do we find? So the primary commercial energy supply, and we see that it's lesser by 70% if we go completely towards renewable technology. And what we found is that it is technically feasible to go 100%, actually 90% renewable. And there is a massive drop in the requirement for primary energy supply. The electricity generation, of course, there is, in the reference energy, it's mainly dependent on coal, whereas in an alternate scenario, it's possible to go 100% renewable in, by 2051, depending on the potential for renewable technologies, that potential for renewable resources that India has. The share of renewable-based capacity, except hydro, drops from 27% to around 21% by 2051 in the REF, whereas it is possible to reach around 100%. So this is definitely sort of a utopian scenario, but it explores the technical feasibility of doing something like this. Here is the generation. Again, so electricity generated is lower in the REN scenario throughout the projection period. Efficiency improvements reduce electricity consumption. This is the energy demand. So again, the primary energy demand in the REN scenario, it's around 58% lower than the BAU, and the industry remains the highest consumer. I'll go over through this. Okay, so in such a scenario, it is possible to bring down the CO2 emissions to a very negligible amount. So clearly, there is a possibility of going into very high renewable scenario, and hence the possibility of creating green jobs. So, and what could this mean? So we can just look at some of the implications of renewable energies and the green job creation. Key observations, aggressive efficiency, etc. I'll just skip through it. Fossil fuel-based plants and technologies need to be phased out. All renewable energy forms, including solar, wind, geothermal, ocean tidal resources, need to be pushed to their technical limits to achieve such a move. The main inferences. So the directional pathway of the renewable energy scenario is very attractive, and it balances multiple considerations of minimizing energy imports, optimizing use of India's substantial renewable energy resources, and cost effectively, and efficient use of capital. The macro inferences, these are some of the inferences that can be taken out. Substitution of coal-based thermal capacity with thermal energy with electrical energy to the context of technologically possible across all sectors. Generation of electricity from renewable resources, freezing coal-based capacity. So we start developing renewable-based capacity and move to a sort of a decentralized electricity generation. I'll just skip this slide. Okay, scope and green jobs. So green jobs are a prerequisite, clearly, to achieve a green economy. The climate change challenge calls for large transitions in different opportunities for direct and indirect employment. And the scope of green jobs in such a scenario, it would be the mission on solar and other renewables, including biofuels, green buildings, public infrastructure development, for example, the dedicated freight corridor or development of metros, schemes that promote energy efficiency, as well as LABL. It's a TERI initiative, which is lighting 1 billion lives. So this, I'll sort of put an example as to some of the work that TERI is doing in promoting green jobs, and how it sort of connects to energy access and reduction of energy poverty. The employment estimates for renewable energy sector in some of the selected countries. So we have fairly worldwide around 300,000 jobs for wind, around 115,000 for solar. Solar thermal, it's around 634, and biomass and biofuels. It's not even world, it's just in the 4 countries, it's around 1.1 million. So total renewables, it's around 2.2 million jobs that are estimated to be existing in the green job sector, in the renewable energy sector. And so clearly, and given that there is a large potential for India to move into a very renewable intensive economy, the potential for creation of green jobs in India is definitely quite a bit. There are some other estimates. India could generate approximately 900,000 jobs by 2025 in biomass gasification, of which 300,000 would be in manufacturing of improved cook stoves, around 600 in areas of processing into briquettes and pellets, etc. in the supply chain. National Solar Mission on decentralized biomass energy has a potential to create around 10 million green jobs. And again, this according to UNEP, the introduction of around 6,100 CNG buses in New Delhi was expected to create around 81,000 new jobs. So definitely these are some of the job creation potential, some of the numbers, if you were to talk about, of that India could generate and creating green jobs and different aspects of energy efficiency improvement and renewable technologies. What is lighting 1 billion facts? Lighting 1 billion lives. So essentially it's a TERI program, which is to bring about renewable energy systems to remote rural areas that do not have access to grid electricity primarily. And what is the driving force behind such a project? It's around, so clearly lack of access to electricity, approximately 400, around 400,000 or 300,000 roughly. Lack access to electricity. 76 million rural households out of 138 million in India have no access to electricity. 65 million of those use kerosene, around 2.3 billion liters of kerosene. Of course, that's a major drain on our, we are having to import most of our crude oil, so that's a major drain on our economy as well. Approximately 5 million ton of CO2 that is going up in the air because of this. And around 70 billion is burnt in smoke every year in wick lamps and kerosene lanterns. So that's approximately the amount of money that we are spending in kerosene and inferior quality of lighting that could be mitigated through renewable energy, through the promotion of renewable energy, which could also create green jobs. So what is LABL? The motto is power to empower. So how does it work? Set up solar charging stations in villages and renting out solar lanterns to displace kerosene lanterns and debris for better illumination and smoke-free indoor environment. Produce solar lanterns to facilitate an advanced rural livelihood generation. So it's actually doing two things. It is essentially providing power. So people are getting jobs in establishing solar panel, manufacture of solar panel, as well as installation of solar panel. And at the same time, because these people are getting access to better lighting, they're able to do more work in the evening or in hours after dark, where they were earlier having to go without electricity or through very inferior qualities of lighting. And how does TERI sort of make this functional? That is, identify and train entrepreneurs to operate charging stations, facilitate creation of energy enterprises of demand and on both supply and demand side. So the prospects for green jobs, LABL has been able to generate direct livelihood for around 160 entrepreneurs as charging station across 160 villages in 12 states of India, of which 20% are women. So a part of the program is also to sort of look at women empowerment, and this is where it comes in, where we specifically sort of ensure that there is some amount of women representatives in the employment that's been generated. LABL is setting up technology resource centers for every 20 charging stations that would cater to offer after-sales servicing to these villages. So essentially, of course, distribution of technology is one thing, but it's essential to maintain it, and this is where also LABL is taking the step to sort of make it permanent so that it doesn't sort of go away after a couple of years when it stops functioning and sort of there's nobody else to replace them or service them. It envisages to setting up to 40,000 charging stations by, so this is actually not 2012, this is 2015, and create around 40,000 green jobs and entrepreneurs. Indirect opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, so long-term implications, extended working hours, livelihood creation, economic enhancement, and local employment, and that's essentially what this program is all about. 15 to 20% of the lanterns are rented out and are used for some livelihood options, for example, weaving, sewing, vending, running tuition centers, etc. So again, enhancing education in that sense, so sort of bringing about sort of change, a social change in these villages. Of the 8,000 lanterns that are disseminated, around 1,200 to 1,600 lanterns are being used for these activities. So we carry on a sort of post-distribution, we have regular surveys and etc. to see the uptake and the usage of these technologies. And so the last point I've already mentioned, so I'll skip through that. Another initiative by TERI is the green building. So the annual increase in demand of around 1.4 billion units, needing approximately 5,500 megawatt per 5-year plan period. So that's approximately the annual sort of the estimated annual increase in demand. And how much does green buildings have the potential to save? Around 30% for residential buildings and 40% for commercial buildings. So investment in green buildings will reduce subsidy because lower demand for diesel-based captive generation, because if you know a lot of these shopping malls, etc., and commercial buildings, as well as residential complexes, for example, if you happen to go around Gurgaon. So given the shortage in electricity supply in such places, a lot of those buildings run on diesel. So there is a potential for serious potential to save fuel and, of course, also emissions in that case. And redirecting the savings as sustainable initiatives that could cover around 30 to 40% of the 30 to 70% of the incremental costs. Other areas, solar components and other renewable jobs in R&D, innovative technology development and adaptation to suit Indian requirements, public transport infrastructure development, and greater involvement of private sector corporates and businesses. So in conclusion, creation of green jobs and cleaner opportunities is sort of imperative if we are to achieve a sustainable socioeconomic growth. Creation of green job in one sector of the economy has the potential to sort of radiate, and this is what we just, an example of it was LABL, where we are talking about promotion of green jobs in distribution of solar systems can have effects across sectors, and that could create jobs in other sectors as well. And India should therefore holistically focus on green job creation in various sectors of growth, such as energy efficient buildings, transportations, and in the agriculture sector. Suitable policies, of course, is very important, and regulatory framework should definitely be in place for achieving India's dream of sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Saptarishi, for almost sticking to the time limit. Okay, we don't have much time. We're going to start our next session in about, well, 10 to 15 minutes. So I will take a couple of questions if there are any for the panel. If anybody has questions, just one round of questions and maybe just one or two. Anybody? Yes, Hamish. Professor Schmidt, Hamish, and then, so we'll take two questions, yes.
Hello, thanks. Hamish MacDonald from the Australian High Commission. Thanks for those presentations. They certainly outline the lots of potential for green jobs. The thing I found when I was listening to it and having been through a bit of the debate in Australia is it did feel a bit unbalanced in that there's bound to be a lot of, some green jobs that are commercially viable and make sense from an income sense, but there wasn't a lot of talk about the aggregate income impacts of shifting towards green jobs and shifting towards greener energy, and that made it feel a bit unbalanced to me. I don't know if there's views from the panel about whether the costs of the shift or the aggregate income impacts of a shift are different depending on where you are in an energy investment cycle. So you talked about how India's got a big investment need facing it now, which is probably different to some other economies. So I was just wondering if there were any comments from any of the panel about more aggregate income impacts and whether the spot in the energy investment cycle mattered.
Good. Yes, Santosh. And then we'll have Professor Schmidt. Yeah.
My question is to Alex. Alex, you know, from your international experience, I don't know how much you know India or how much you worked in India, but given your international experience, where would you put your money, in a sense, if you have limited resources, as we do? Because public resources are very limited, although we have a 8-sector climate change action plan and so on. Where would you focus?
In the morning we talked about regulation as a barrier to development, and I wonder a little bit why the aspect of regulation in the other way around, which means standard regulation, to regulate forward by new standards, by quality standards, to give by this way the incentive to producers, to service deliveries, to apply to the new standards. I haven't seen this kind of as a strategy for providing, for developing more green jobs. Just to give an example, as a young boy in my village, all the waste was put in the river, or it was accumulated on a hill outside the village. And so, of course, there had to come some regulation that it was forbidden. And on the other hand, there had to be an investment for respective dealing with the waste, and waste is also a raw product, things like that. So it's just a question why it's the issue of regulation, forward regulation, standard regulation, why did it not come up?
Thank you. May I request Dr. Alex Bowen to attempt to answer those 3 questions, and then I'll go to the rest of the panelists.
Right. So the question of the overall impact, I mean, I did try to emphasize that this is indeed an important aspect, because I think the labour market impacts of going green are much more widespread than simply the number of jobs in producing solar PV panels or whatever. There are two ways of measuring costs that people tend to look at. One is some sort of overall measure of GDP losses, where I think the best work suggests there is a cost, but it might be as little as 1.5–2% of GDP over the long haul. That doesn't take account of the fact, and I think this is what you were hinting at, that you may have to make bigger sacrifices than that initially, because you may have to use some of the GDP that's left to invest when you would have preferred to have consumed it. That I think is also a bit of an issue, but the best estimates I've seen suggest that that's likely to be less than 2% of GDP. If you do a lot on energy efficiency, it might not even be positive after a while, because you might actually get away with a smaller energy supply system. There's a big EU research project called the Limits Project, which has come up recently with some numbers for investment needs. They do tend to be bigger for economies like India, which are growing more rapidly, because they've got to establish the capital stock. That's one reason why these issues are very current for India, because unless we have carbon pricing or some other incentive to go green, India is going to get stuck with high carbon infrastructure, and that would be a big mistake. Where would I put my money in terms of resource investment? I don't know enough about the Indian case. I would say two things though, three things. One, the energy systems around the world have got to change. They're the really harmful systems at the moment from the point of view of human-induced human-induced climate change. Second, I think that there are opportunities in changing land use which don't get the attention they deserve, because a lot of the discussion is in developed countries. The scope in tropical countries in particular, but also emerging market countries to do much more on land use, I think should get much more emphasis. I think it's fantastic that China in particular has done a lot on reforestation. I think India's heading in that way too. That's great. I think that we also need to consider investment now to improve health now, and this is where the whole issue of local particulate pollution is so important. And I would say when politicians say we should grow first and worry about going green later, I've often wondered, have they asked poor people today what their choices would be if those poor people are faced with polluted atmosphere, polluted water, no dependable energy supply. There are a lot of things which could help poor people in the near term and improve our environment. I've
Thank you.
A question about regulation and standards, but perhaps that should be for one of my colleagues.
Dr. Sharma, would you like to comment? No? Any comment on question on regulations, standards?
Which aspect of regulation you are talking about? So quality of regulation, from my experience, I'll tell you that if you see the history of environmental legislation in India, we start in 70s. So 1969 first pollution board came up in Maharashtra. 74 we got Water Act. Then 77 we got Water Cess Act. 1981 we got Air Act. And 86 we got Environmental Act, which is now Umbrella Act. And hundreds and thousands of regulations. If you study the regulation of India on environmental front, even on energy part, you will find they are as strict as any developed country. Rather, somewhere they are more strict. The problem is not regulation, framing the regulation. Problem is enforcement. They are implemented also. It implemented. I told you that I give the example of the dog moving on that waste, garbage bin. Regulation is there that you will find if you throw the garbage. But who is seeing that and who is implementing and who is enforcement? So regulations are very good in India, as strict as in any developed country, but enforcement is very poor. And it is not only regulation, it is also public apathy. Public has environment problem cannot be solved by one person. That is the misconception. People think that is the responsibility of the government and authorities. It is also the responsibility of the public.
Thank you. Saptarishi, final 1 minute staccato comment.
Yeah, so I could sort of answer to the first question, or give a little bit of insight on the first question. So the overall impact of going green, now, you know, unlike the developed country where a lot of the infrastructure is already in place, India, the infrastructure is still under development and we haven't yet locked in. So we see a huge requirement for demand in the future. So we are still in that scope where we could now shift to green technology development, and instead of, you know, building in new fossil fuel-based power plants or investing more on coal-based technology, we could let it be and let them die out their normal economic life and move to a sort of a green trajectory. And in that period, in another 10 to 20 years, we could sort of develop that base where we could move the people or the job displaced from coal mining and these fossil fuel-based sectors to green sector. So I think for India, we are at a juncture where we could make that decision whether we want to go green. And I do not have exact numbers, but it seems like it's a feasible thing without really having a negative impact on the job creation. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Saptarishi. I guess the challenge for a country like India is to begin, the question that Hamish asks is to try and begin to collect evidence on what the costs and benefits are. And once you have the evidence, then even if the evidence is in favor of growing green, I think even if it is overwhelmingly in favor of growing green, I think the challenges that confront us or could confront us would be related to the political economy of implementing, as I think Dr. Bowen was referring to as well. But we don't have time to further prolong this session. We've run out of time. We're waiting for the special address. So let me not take any more of your time, but welcome you all for the next session, which we will start in, I guess, 10 minutes. But before I do that, let me thank all the panelists for a very stimulating discussion. This is a newer, relatively kind of newer topic, but a common theme running through this session and the previous sessions was, of course, the nature of the skills that will be required to promote the green economy. So thank you, Dr. Bowen, thank you, Drs. Sharma and Saptarishi, for making this session very stimulating and rich. Thank you very much. Let's give them a big round of applause. Well, good evening, everybody. Very warm welcome once again to this special address by Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India. We don't know in which form that will exist going forward. The special address, follows what I think we've had a very rich discussion across 3 different sessions today. We had a morning session which talks about the need to creating jobs and productive jobs, good quality jobs, the interface with urban governance, the interface with cities. Then we discussed the need for bridging the skill deficit, the skill gaps. We needed to talk about reducing the unemployment rates, especially amongst youth, which is quite a travesty in the growth process. We also talked about the need for greening our growth and therefore greening our jobs and the skill deficit within that sector. So we've had a very rich discussion already. And between the first day today, at the end of the first day, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Ahluwalia give us this special address on jobs creation in India and to draw some lessons from international experience. And given the expertise that we have assembled in the room, and I see number of experts who worked in this area, who's worked in jobs, what I would suggest to make this session really engaging and fruitful is for Dr. Ahluwalia to speak for about 15 minutes, set the stage, make a few introductory remarks, and then have an engaging and stimulating session with lots of questions and perhaps insights from your own specific experiences. So I think that will work best, given that we've had a day of scholarly discussions, sometimes policy oriented, sometimes academic. So let this be an informal session where we engage, exchange ideas, comment and question on some of the things that you have experience with. Before I hand over the floor to Dr. Ahluwalia, you have his bio in the booklet. All of you have been given the booklet, but I just want to read out a couple of things. His CV, whenever I read his CV, and I guess anybody else reads his CV, it just doesn't cease to amaze. So he has an astonishing CV. And he needs no introduction. As I said, he was Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission and has been a key figure in India's economic reforms, and he was conferred, for our foreign guests, he was conferred a very high civilian honor, which is called the Padma Vibhushan by the President of India in 2011. He's been to the best universities in the world. He was a Rhodes Scholar, very prestigious scholarship, which was given, I guess, at the time, Dr. Ahluwalia would have got the scholarship to 2 people, I think 2 students from all over the country. Now, the Rhodes Scholarship, I think, accommodates 6, but at that time it would have been just 2. After completion at Oxford, he went to the World Bank as a young professional and has held various positions, including Chief of Income Distribution Division. He came back to India in 1979 and was associated until very recently with the Planning Commission, and as I said, was a key figure in India's economic reforms. He's written on various aspects of development economics. He's published in journals to which economists would die to publish in, including the American Economic Review, the JPE, Journal of Political Economy, and also the Journal of Economic Perspectives. He's an honorary fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, and a member of the board of directors of the Global Green Growth Institute in Seoul. So we are extremely fortunate that Dr. Ahluwalia is here to give us this special address on job creation. Thank you, Monty.
Do you want me to speak from here? Thank you. Thanks very much, Rajat, for that very glowing introduction. I'm particularly pleased that you only want me to kick off a discussion. I mean, the main reason for that is that this is a group of researchers, and although I haven't read the papers, I have looked at some of the abstracts that were sent, and it's quite clear that lots of critical issues are going to be gone into in great depth. So I thought after you've had a high tea, and before you tuck into your dinner, it would be a good opportunity to try to sort of overview and throw out a few issues. And I'd be very happy to interact on them. I mean, this will also educate me, because your questions will no doubt reflect issues that have been raised. So, I said to myself, what are the things that I ought to touch upon? And I've actually got a list of 6 things to touch upon. And since Rajat has given me 15 minutes, that gives me about 2.5 or something like that for each, which is just right in my view. First, the title of my talk says something about international lessons. Now, I want to be clear. I don't know enough about international experience to indicate what the lessons are for us. Of course, it's always relevant. But I do want to mention one thing, and that is, how did this jobs issue get to the forefront of the discussion internationally? Now, I'm going to put forward a set of statements which could be controversial. It came to the top of the agenda in the aftermath of the global crisis of 2008. when basically a lot of people were losing jobs. And interestingly, nobody actually wanted to say that we must get growth back, because they were losing jobs because output growth was slowing down. But somehow talking about growth looked as if you were some kind of an agent of Wall Street. I mean, I know this from having been Sherpa, G20 Sherpa, and we kept saying, look, how come you're sneaking in the jobs issue? I mean, this is, by the way, sneaking in the jobs issue from the industrialized countries' point of view. It wasn't being pushed by the developing countries. And frankly, our suspicion was that for some years, there had been a lot of muted concern that the way international specialization was working, essentially a lot of the jobs were being outsourced to the emerging market countries. In my view, this is an excellent idea. The consequential problems in the industrialized countries needed to be handled separately, but there was this concern, and I think there still is this concern, that to what extent is the concern about jobs simply to be viewed as a way of bringing back growth, because there was some of that. I mean, politicians in Western countries didn't want to be talking about growth, because that is Wall Street, that's the financial sector, and those are all no-nos. But they wanted to talk about jobs. So if they could go forward and say, we're going to create jobs, everybody would say, wonderful. The only problem with that is a lot of the people who were saying, what about creating jobs, were actually also saying, what about preventing jobs from being outsourced? And I don't want to press this point, but it's something that needs to be kept in the back of one's mind. And very important to note, by the way, that the depth of the angst in the industrialized world was not about the proportion, the number of jobs lost. I mean, so unemployment went from whatever, 6% to 9%, 5% to 9%, 4%. The angst was about distributional change over the previous 20 years, which was humongous, in the sense that for the previous God knows how many years, virtually all the growth and the benefits were accruing to the top 1%. I mean, this is all the Joe Stiglitz OECD numbers. Secondly, that the median US income, and probably also true in Europe, hadn't increased for 20 years. So it is literally true in industrialized countries that the rich were getting humongously richer, and the median, the middle classes, were actually not benefiting. They were able to hide this gross unfairness by generating a real estate boom, so everybody felt the equity in their homes was going up. But we know that that was false. And when that broke, everybody said, what the hell is going on? That was the international context in which jobs came to the focus. Now, interestingly, in our perspective, jobs have never been the exclusive focus, for the simple reason that the measured unemployment rate is actually quite low, simply because the poor can't afford to be unemployed. The real problem in India is that the income levels of those ostensibly employed are too low. And so I can remember on several occasions saying that the measures of unemployment that are being compared are quite ridiculous. I remember at one point the representative of the ILO, Ms. Postel, very nice woman, quoted some ludicrous number of unemployment, which I raised, and she was courteous enough to check and say, you're right. I mean, this is a misreading of the data, so we withdraw the number. So I think this is on the international side, it's become a big issue. It is an important issue. Behind it are a lot of important developments in the industrialized world, but let's be very clear about it. Somewhere hidden in that concern are serious doubts about how globalization is working. And we should come upfront on that. And there ought to be a much better debate on this, both within the industrialized countries and between industrialized countries and developing countries. That's point number one. Second point I want to make is that, I think when we have a discussion in India on jobs, employment, and so forth, we need to realize that the reason why our situation is not really comparable with the West, or actually even the more advanced emerging markets. You know, we get classed as emerging markets, although we're only $1,500 per capita. Most of the other emerging markets are actually much higher. We are the lowest per capita income of all the BRICS, lowest per capita income of all the G20. Okay, and even China is about 2.5 or 3 times in something like that. So India is actually at the bottom of this level, and some of what I'm going to say is a reflection of that. First, the issue of organized versus unorganized. I'm sure that it has come up, and I thought I saw Santosh here, so I'm sure he's brought all this out in whatever. Have you already spoken, Santosh, or you're going to do it later? Anyway, it's all there in amongst knowledgeable people. But the following things are very important. That, you know, only about 20% of the Indian labor force can be said to belong in the organized sector. And here, organized means with relation to the establishment that's employing you. Okay? And out of that, only about 7.5% of the labor force is actually in the formal sector. Organized sector has formal employment and informal employment. I mean, formal means contractual employment with lots of social security. Informal means casual employment, temporary employment, where you're not part of the permanent labor force. So, you know, when, okay, you may say, well, but you know, 50% of our labor force in agriculture. So these numbers, and you don't expect that to be organized and so on. If you were to limit the thing to non-agriculture, then the numbers come out as follows. 40% of our labor force in the non-agricultural sector is organized. And by the way, that includes all of government employment, which is quite a lot. Within that, about 17, I mean, if you look at those in that category who have formal employment, i.e. a contractual relationship, out of the non-agricultural workforce, it's 17%. So, you know, I think one of the issues you have to consider is whenever you use categories for labor, jobs, etc., they're totally relevant for organized come formal. When I say organized come formal, the organized is much larger than the formal, because the organized sector employs a lot of people who are not classified as formally employed. But still, it's a small percentage of our total labor force. And you have to keep in mind that whatever lessons you want to draw or policy recommendations you want to make have to be fitted into this framework. And at every point, we should be remembering, is it more important to create an environment where income growth of the non-formal fellows is boosted, or is it only important to consider what's happening in the formal sector? I'm not going to answer this question, but it's something that may come up in discussions. My third point is that one of the big phenomena here in India is the difference between jobs and employment. I assume that jobs implies being an employee, whereas employment includes self-employment. So 50% of the labor force is self-employed. Some of it in the organized sector, some of it in the non-organized sector. And if you look at the salaried class of the labor force as a whole, only 50% is salaried, and of them, about 16.4% is regular contractual employment. So far too much of the discussions that we have about, you know, terms of employment, this, that, and the other, is actually about a very restrictive part of the labor force, even if you exclude agriculture. I mean, this is a critical point. Now, having said that, then most discussions about what to do kind of boil down into demand and supply factors. I mean, I think first of all in India, we should be concerned about raising the demand for labor. That will help the self-employed, that will generate more income, whether for formal or informal, and certainly for all the self-employed and in agriculture also. So whatever it is that's going to raise the demand for labor is good. Clearly, a higher growth rate will raise the demand for labor. if the growth pattern is biased towards highly capital intensive technologies and sectors. I mean, for example, if you have a mining oriented growth, and we are never going to have that for other reasons, but if you did, it's quite possible that the demand for labor won't increase at all, because essentially it's highly capital intensive. But you know, if you have a growth process where a lot of growth comes into agriculture, a lot of it comes into services, a lot of it comes into what one would call low skill, less capital intensive manufacturing, then everything you do on that side is going to generate more demand. I'm sure that the problem is when you start with labor and then you expand to include all these things, you're really covering every chapter of an economic review or a plan document. So the instrumentalities are a little different from that specific sector. But then you have the supply side on labor, and that is of course very strictly narrowly what people would call a part of labor economics. And I think there are two conflicting kind of elements. One is the whole demographic dividend story. I think it's important from a demographic point of view. For the next 20 years, we're going to have, we're going to be the only country that is going to have an increasing supply of labor. Others will in some sense have a shortage of labor. Mind you, a shortage of labor doesn't mean that they're going to be importing labor. It just means that at the present configuration of prices, they're going to have more labor. So what's going to happen is they're going to become more capital intensive, technologies are going to save on labor, etc., etc. That's the bottom line. So what does India do with this huge demographic dividend? And clearly, in order for the demographic dividend not to become what they call a demographic disaster, a hell of a lot has to be done on the demand side for labor. All that stuff about growth, pattern of growth, and whatever the policies that are needed to bring that about. On the supply side, it is extremely important that this labor be of a quality that can actually be used in a growing economy. Now I have Manish here, who's actually been the expert on this, advising us when I was in the Planning Commission. I hope you're continuing to advise the government. And you know, he's been a very articulate spokesman of the deficiencies in our skilling system. And I agree with a lot of almost everything that he must have said or is about to say. But the bottom line here is that, again, you get two, when you go to these, particularly if you go to these TV programs, you know, somebody invariably gets up and says that there is an enormous demand, not just Manish, I mean a lot of other fellows, there's an enormous demand for skilled labor, carpenters, plumbers, they're just not there. That would suggest that, you know, there's something wrong with our skilling system. And that's absolutely correct, there is. And many things are happening there. And I think it's very important for us, if we are learning lessons, to focus on those. Because a lot of the other macro demand issues, I don't think the lessons are either unknown, or when there are lessons, applicability is an issue. But I think on skilling, this is a crucial point. And some progress has been made in this matter. Manish was telling me outside that a very important development in the last 2 or 3 days is the passage of the apprenticeship amendment to the Apprenticeship Act, which had been in the pipeline for some time. And it's a very sad commentary that no newspaper reported it. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that, you know, sometimes newspapers want to only report critical things, but right now the government's going through a normal honeymoon. This is a very specific development which is very important. And I was amazed when he told me this because no newspapers reported it. So on the skilling side, lots and lots of stuff that we need to do, and we certainly need to learn on apprenticeship and so forth from the Germans, from the Singaporeans, many others. My last point is not so much a point, but an issue. And I think it's an issue which requires a bit of reflection. And that is that any medium-term sort of assessment of what's going to happen to jobs, etc., must be anchored in a perception of structural change. It would be the hugest mistake imaginable to assume that structure is going to remain unchanged and demands are going to go up. actually was going to happen, what are the structural changes? Number one, agricultural employment must go down. Frankly, if it doesn't, it's a sign that we're not achieving the results we want. So we do not want an increase in agricultural employment. This, by the way, I mean, one of these days you should have a meeting of MPs and ask them to vote on the proposition that, do you agree that we do not want an increase in labor employment and agriculture? I mean, they will unanimously say this is completely wrong. What we do want is an increase in demand for agriculture which will jack up real wages. That, by the way, will make some of the farmer MPs have doubts about this. But it is a structural change issue. The second structural change is the process of urbanization, which is kind of linked in a way, but actually different, because you can reduce labor share in agriculture and just have a lot of non-agricultural activity in rural areas. And indeed, that will happen. But in India, with the lowest, I'm sure this issue has come up, so I'll just touch on it, with the lowest rate of urbanization in the world and a virtual certainty that it should go up, then labor policy and whole business of how do you get people productively employed, how do you create an environment where people invest in urban areas, maybe not so much in the metros, but in the smaller towns, all of that, sensible labor policy ought to be structured around the proposition that there's going to be tremendous change in the urbanization front. So that raises the usual issues of what to do about services for this expanding employment. I'm sure that's come up. But you know, more important also is that if these are going to be increasingly modern industries, housing for this new category of people in urban areas is a huge, huge challenge. And how exactly is that going to be handled? I mean, it's quite critical that that be handled well, because you could do everything right. But if you're running a system in which basically there's no way in which the growing labor force entering urban areas can actually get a house, all you're going to have is more and more encroachment, and down that path goes a whole string of things which cannot be regarded by anyone as good. Second, structural change, and I noticed that there was a paper on green jobs. Green jobs is a big thing. We're in favor of all jobs. I think I like the abstract that I saw. I think very correctly posed the issue that will the switch to the green economy create new net jobs? I mean, clearly it's going to create more green jobs. But the issue that arises is, will the green jobs be more and of better quality than the brown jobs that would have happened in the absence of a green economy? And I think how far you make this into a general equilibrium analysis is difficult, because, I mean, you could argue that if you go the brown economy, the economy will collapse, so there won't be any jobs anyway, brown or red or whatever. So the move to a green economy, if it is felt to be pretty much unavoidable, and one can argue about the pace of it, and I'm sure they're doing that in Lima right now. So I think we need to be clear, what is it that we're really talking about? And if the name of the game is that, look, the shift to greenness is a compulsion anyway, you know, what it does to jobs is only a second order issue. The important thing is how to get the main thing done. I fear that in the international context, very often, the agenda of green jobs is bunged in because jobs is important, and there's some kind of a hope that if only you can make this look like green jobs, everybody will go for the green economy. And I think that's putting the cart the other way around from the horse. Well, there are lots and lots of other things that one could be talking about, but I just thought I'd throw out these as issues that struck me. And if you've already had a long discussion on it, I apologize, but if you want to have more, I'm very happy to interact. Thank you.
Thank you, Montek, as usual, very insightful. So the floor is open. One of the things, if I may kick off, one of the things that, you know, we discussed many of these issues, including the distinction between jobs and employment. I believe there was a question in the morning on that distinction from the audience on the distinction between jobs and employment. But one of the other things that we did discuss was the need to change labor laws. And as usual, there seems to be, didn't seem to be an agreement on how much the existing labor laws bite. And that legislative reform of labor laws would take a lot of time, and therefore the important thing right now is not to try and attempt to kind of revamp the legislative process of the laws, but rather get the plumbing right, get the governance right. And Manish in the morning spent a lot of time saying that we know what to do, it's the how that is important, and we just need to get on with the how. And get the governance right, get the plumbing right, and the policies are in place, if I'm not misrepresenting what you said, Manish, in the morning. So just to kick off this kind of interaction with Montague, the floor is yours, please. Alex, would you want to, the question that Montague raised about
Yes,
net new jobs?
Yes, well, I was very pleased that Montek agreed that should be the focus, because I share the view that the green jobs narrative is misleading, and one should focus on the prime benefits of going green. And I was making the point in the earlier